Welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of the Mind Body Evolution podcast. Today's episode is slightly dense, so I asked Dr. Stout to give me a little introduction to what the episode was going to be about, and I surreptitiously recorded it, which is why at the end he says, let's get this recording going. Anyway, what follows is Dr. Stout's introduction, followed by our regular podcast. Enjoy.
We were talking about last week. I wanted to sort of continue into last week's. We were talking about how resources and environment can change how gender roles work, both from monogamy to polygamy, or from there's the baboons and how they change their society relation to resources, and then connect that to the way we've seen the binary of gender from the period of the caves through, say, the Middle Ages, looking at things like the demiurgos and alchemy and the nature of binaries in alchemy. And then alchemy, the project of alchemy, trying to bring genders together into this unified whole, and how the project of certainly the church in the Middle Ages was trying to separate anything female from the divine, and that there was these tensions for a long time, and how what was this sort of primary creative force in the Greeks, the demiurgos, it was a creative force for good, became a creative force for evil by the Middle Ages.
So basically, your high concept would be the immutable doesn't exist.
Yeah, no, things are immutable, but there's only certain ways to think about things.
Anything that you think is unchangeable eventually will be proven
will change, but not necessarily in time, and not necessarily for the good.
Right, exactly. Right.
Okay. Hopefully we're heading in a good direction now. And that we're changing.
Makes you feel like chaos reigns.
Well, that was what the whole purpose of it was trying to organize out of the chaos. Certainly what the Greeks thought about. But we should start recording before we get too into it.
Today is Friday, January 26th. This is episode 4 of season 2. Amazing. Hi, Josh.
Hi, Eric.
So, the title today was really long.
It was a long title, yeah. So I was thinking about what we talked about last week with the Barbie movie and gender roles in general, and primate mating systems, and how we're entering a period of sort of flux in human gender roles, and that often the people who are sort of reactionary against this like to say, well, biology is binary and biology is fixed. And I've been thinking about that, and how within biology there is absolutely flux within gender roles, and there are times when inflexible gender roles can lead to problems. And so I'm going to sort of start off with some stories within biology, but then I want to get into how our notion of divinity and our relation with the spiritual world has been gendered for a very long time, and the way gender roles within our sort of evolution of cultural consciousness have changed over time.
All right.
So I was thinking about killer whales.
Okay.
And killer whales are like us. They have culture. They have culture that can determine their approach to resource acquisition. And so in the Pacific Northwest, there are two major different killer whale populations. One of them is hunting sea lions and other marine mammals. Wouldn't say no to a beluga whale. And the other one is are salmon specialists. And they haven't interbred for a million years or so. They're completely separate populations.
One population will eat a whole bunch of different things, and another one will just eat salmon.
Any salmon you want. They're fish eaters, all right? But the big fish that are in that area are salmon. But they're not going to determine which salmon they're eating.
Okay.
And the other ones are going to eat any marine mammal, but not a salmon. So they've become specialists. They know what they're doing. They have a culture that enables them to do this. They have a culture based on their resources. And the culture based on the resources that is focusing on salmon has not been doing very well because salmon stocks have been going down. It's a little bit further south group, so they've been impacted by global warming pretty badly. So the Pacific Northwest population of orcas is dependent on salmon and is in decline. And one of the reasons has to do with their cultural stereotypical gender roles. A large bull male orca is much bigger than the females. So much like a silverback gorilla or some of these other mammals where you see males fighting each other for access to the females. And if you're a big male lion and you're twice the size of the females, everything's about fighting the other lions to access to the females. And male lions also very stereotypical gender roles. They work with the females to get prey, but it's mostly the females that do all the actual prey because the males are simply too big to hunt them down. And this is something that genetically works. As long as the females get more food for that male lion, they will spread the genes around by having offspring and being successful. So in these orcas, what has happened is the male orcas are too big to catch salmon. And their mothers take care of them. So we'd understood that menopause was something that was rare in the animal kingdom. You want to have babies for as long as you can in your life. And in anthropology, human evolutionary theory, the idea was that menopause allowed older sort of a matriarch of a family to take care of the younger babies. And there was decent evidence that if, even in the modern world, if a mother lived near her mother, her offspring would have a larger chance of survival. Even in the modern world, survival, like really cut and dried stuff. If the mother lived within 50 miles of her mother, that there was a major effect that was measurable. You know,
amazing.
You had to look at a lot of people to find it because it's not
yeah.
like everyone who doesn't live with their mother babies die, right? It's a tiny actual effect, but it's measurable and it's real.
Yeah.
And so that was our understanding of where menopause had come from, that it was this evolutionary technique to have older women stop paying attention to their own babies, but make grandchildren, basically. And this was an evolutionary advantage. And what the killer whales are doing is their mothers get to the point where they're too old to have babies. They go through menopause, unlike almost every other species. And it's interesting that this one is happening in one of the few species out there with culture, with traditions, right? So these orcas are singing songs to each other. They have languages. They communicate, and their songs.
I was going to ask, how do we know this? You answered that question immediately.
And their songs are different from the other groups, the ones that don't hunt salmon. They have their own traditions. They have their own culture, and when a female orca is no longer able to have babies, she's taking care of her adult son, who can't hunt for himself very successfully because the salmon just are too, they can turn too quickly. And while
they're much more agile.
They're much more agile. A big bull orca can outrace a salmon, but can't outturn it. So the salmon will always get away. And so what happens is his mother will go along, catch a salmon, bite off the head for him, and then leave the body floating out behind for the son to pick up. So she's basically like cutting the crusts off his bread. But she's doing this because this enables her to have a successful reproducing son who's bigger than all the other sons and is able to spread her genes further on. So evolution has favored this cultural adaptation. Other orcas go through menopause, but are not required in the same way. This survived in this particular culture because they were hunting salmon, and the big bulls couldn't compete. They would have had to hunt something else.
Yeah.
And in this particular culture, it worked because the mothers were then able to pass on their own genes by protecting their sons and having their sons be reproductively successful. However, as the salmon stocks have gone down, as it's becoming more and more difficult, now we have these sons that are completely dependent upon their mothers. When their mothers die, the sons die usually within a year. Even though they're still middle-aged, they're not able to fend for themselves well enough to survive.
They starve to death.
They end up starving to death, usually within a year of their mothers dying. And their mothers can live to 60, 80 years old. So this gets them into their 50s and 60s, but still they don't survive.
Amazing. They are dependent their entire lives.
And this is entirely a cultural thing that they have built for themselves, but they've reached a dead end. They can't switch into another mechanism because their gender stereotypes are so fixed in this particular thing. They would have to switch to a new resource, and they don't have the cultural wherewithal to understand how to do that. Everything they do in their lives is about hunting salmon. Everything is about the salmon. They can't choose a different path. They've been on this path for 1 million years now. They have very strict gender stereotypes, and without something changing in their culture, they can't get out of this dead end they've reached for themselves. And so I was thinking about that in relation to human gender stereotypes, that we often start associating the way we are as being an absolute situation. And we could get ourselves into a dead end if we're not careful.
We are often told that is the situation.
Yeah, exactly. And that flexibility is something that is built into culture, right? You don't have to actually have a genetic change. You could just change it by teaching your children differently. But because we often see these things as biologically absolute, we don't realize that they're amenable to cultural differences. And that in the natural world, these are usually based on resources. But we now live in a world where with in many ways, abundant resources, in other ways, limited resources, things like university positions or good jobs. These are limited resources, or apartments. These are all limited resources in the world we've created. It's not because they're limited in an absolute way. We've created an artificial limit to them. And so this is in many ways driving the way our culture works. There is no limit to the number of apartments we could build, but we only build as many as we need, I guess. And what need is always sort of at the maximum level. It's always pressed.
Right. Need is.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about
question.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've related to gender roles within human culture, really right from the very beginning. The first people who were trying to understand in a larger sense what cave paintings were, and not just that's a painting of a horse, right? You could understand, everyone gets that part, but why is there a painting of a horse there? Why is there a mammoth? What are these things for? And the two competing ideas were it was either hunting magic or it was about gender. And so there was one person who, in my opinion, probably overly determined what everything was, but he looked at every cave painting and said it was either male or female, and divided everything into this very strict binary of iconography. And while I think he was doing this a little bit too much, I don't think he was completely wrong. I think people were trying to get at what are these gender binaries? How do they work together in the natural world? They were trying to understand themselves in many ways. So they would build these things that were clearly an amalgam of male and female joined together, showing male and female power interacting. The Minotaur and the Lioness was the classic one that I've mentioned before, together forming almost a yin-yang kind of shape. That they understood these as a dualistic but unified, and with blending between the two. There was no hard line between the two. This idea, I think, gave rise to, in later cultures, much of our understanding of religion, of goddesses, of gods, how they relate to each other. You have the male and the female, the sky and the earth. the water and the shore, all of these things where you have mixing of two things coming together creates the offspring, the creation. So this is something that's very deep in our understanding of biology. Right, exactly, of binaries coming together and in the mixing creating something new, right? This is how children happen. And so these are the kinds of things that we think of as absolute, but they're by no means outside of our culture, and culture can definitely change. So these things came out of the caves, became more formalized religion. At first, you would have had goddesses and gods having their own domains, but sometimes one would steal from the other. So Inanna stole the codes for civilization from the sun god and actually took them to herself. And she had symbols like the owl that we later see in Athena. So all of these things were flexible. She divided almost into two separate goddesses, the goddess of love and the goddess of wisdom and technology that became Athena, who, by the way, was a virgin, right? The Parthenos. Parthenos means virgin. The Parthenon to Athena was the place of the virgin. So we started to separate the idea of the sex goddess and the goddess who doesn't have sex. And that became really important in our culture, the idea of this goddess not having sex. It became Mary, became a lot of this non-reproductive female version. But in the original idea of the beginning of everything, in both Greek and Egyptian thought, there was this sort of unmixed whole that gave rise to the divisions between everything. And this was often seen as, if not feminine, at least a mixture of feminine and male. It was not a male god sticking out his finger and saying, "Let there be light." This was
the Tao.
It was like before the Tao, the thing that the Tao came from, or in I really don't know that much about Hinduism, but the breath that gives rise to Brahma, the thing before the division, before even the thing that gets divided, the first thing, and that was what Plato called the demiurgos. It was the thing that starts everything. Aristotle's prime mover, the thing that, you've got a whole bunch of your dominoes set up. What pushes the first domino over, gets everything going. The very beginning, the universe before the universe, which you can't talk about because there is no before time. That thing, whatever that is, was the demiurgos.
Turtles.
It's turtles all the way down. But if it's not turtles all the way down, there has to be a thing, right? And so the demiurgos was what created order out of chaos. It created the cosmos. Cosmos has the same roots as cosmetics, making beauty. Chaos was the sea of undifferentiated uniformity. In modern cosmology, it's essentially what there is before the Higgs boson field gives everything its individuality. It's this sea of everything that you then get differentiations from. And so this was what was coming out of Neoplatonism, is this idea of the organization of the cosmos is what brings order and beauty to everything. And it's part of what natural philosophers are there to do, to understand the universe and bring order and beauty to everything. In Egyptian thought, there was this first undivided god of magic, Heka, which meant activated bodily energy, which is interesting. So chi, he basically was chi. And he represented what happens when opposites come together and create energy. So we understand this today in physics. You need a plus and a minus to have actually energy happen. You have to have the top of the hill and the bottom of the hill, or you don't have any energy potential. So he was energy potential before anything happened, which is why you don't hear about him a lot in Egyptian religion, because he's just assumed. He doesn't get drawn much. He doesn't get represented much.
Just has to be there.
He just has to be there. He's before Ra. He's before all of this stuff.
What's the name again?
Hekka.
Hekka.
He's the male and the female. He's activated bodily energy. Your Ka is your spirit. So your Ka is what is trying to be preserved when you're making a mummy and burying someone under a pyramid. Hekka is the activated Ka. So it's sort of like Chi. It's these opposites that have come together. But when they're split apart again, then you get male and female. You get all these potentials. And in Egyptian stuff, everything was always mixed and then always splitting into humans and animals, males and females, night and day, etc. All of these things were together and then splitting and together and splitting. This became the Egyptian Holy Family. It became Hathor and Horus. It became Isis and Horus. Isis basically is Hathor in many ways. Hathor has the horns of the cow. Isis also has the horns of the cow. Hathor was the house of Horus. What means where Horus came from, essentially, was where the name Hathor comes from. Isis is the mother of Horus. Horus is the infant child who represents the coming together of the male and the female. And then the infant child is the actualization of this coming together to make this infant child. This was then represented in Greek mythology because Greeks didn't completely get the Egyptians. They were really into them, but they didn't always understand where all these mythologies were coming from. So they started trying to build their own secret mysteries. This would be where we get Orphic mysteries, the idea of resurrection. So the Osiris resurrection happening is then copied in the resurrection of Dionysus in the Orphic mysteries. Dionysus is wrapped inside the Orphic egg. This very beginning divides into two things. So this became the idea of things being wrapped into a cohesive whole and then emerging from something as it hatching from the egg. And we see this over and over again in Greek religion. When the Greeks tried to take these concepts of this infant Horus being the actualized version of male and female coming together, they then turned him into this new god, Harpocrates, the god of secrets, because in Egyptian hieroglyphics, the hieroglyphic for child is finger over the lips. And the Greeks saw that as a secret.
I don't like the way this is going.
Things get a little weird for a while. And so Harpocrates was the infant that saw Aphrodite and Eros getting together. And it had to be kept a secret under the rose, sub rosa, meant the thing everything was hidden over. And so Harpocrates became the holder of the secret of these two forces, Eros and love, being joined together, which was forbidden because in their case, it was incest. And so this became the symbol of secrets right through the Knights Templar. When the Knights Templar wanted to mark a document as secret, they had what had been sort of taken from these Egyptian ideas of unity of two sides and essentially a cult of Ra through the Greeks, and then used that as their symbol. And this was sorry, I've lost the name.
What was the symbol?
Abraxas. Abrasax. Middle Ages. They got confused about Greeks.
And what was the symbol?
Okay, so what the symbol was originally was a picture of Ra with two snakes next to him. And then those snakes joined with Ra to become two snakes with Ra coming out of the middle. Basically, this is the same symbol that we have for Starbucks. So you have the mermaid with the two snakes. It was like that, the joining of two things. And that this joined symbol was the origin of magic, was the origin of everything, and was also the symbol for secrecy, this joining together of concepts, of ideas, and then the thing that everything then progressed from, the unknown joined thing at the very beginning. By the time this got... let's go back a little bit again. We'll go back to Alexandria for a moment. So,
okay.
So these concepts were coming out of early Gnostic Christianity, and the idea of maybe the universe wasn't one thing but was two things. And so the Gnostics were very much into Manichaeism, the idea that there was two worlds, a real world and a spiritual world, a good world and a bad world. There was a group in Alexandria in the Gnostic period, so Christian Gnostics, but working in a Egyptian context, took this symbol of Ra with the two snakes and made Abrasax their main deity. So the idea was the Ouroboros, not the Ouroboros, sorry, the Demiurgos.
Mm-hmm.
Ouroboros is not unrelated.
Yeah.
The Demiurgos had given rise to this division, and the Demiurgos' son was Abrasax, i.e. Hathor. And this was basically a way of relating the idea of God with his son Jesus to Egyptian ideas of their gods and their son, and Greek things and their gods and their son, and the idea of having this actualized thing that had come out of a duality. So in Christianity, we'd left behind this idea of duality. It was just the Father. There was no mother, and Mary was certainly important, but she herself was not a goddess. Jesus was entirely the same as the Father, entirely part of the God, and this is exactly what the Neoplatonists would have thought.
Linked by the Trinity.
Right. There's no separation. Right. Yeah. There's no separation. And so these were the ideas that had come out of the Assyrian culture, where you had the god and the energy from the god creating the king, who was the personified God on earth. And so that was Jesus, the Holy Ghost, and God above. So that was Asher, the hand of Asher.
But it had all started as a combining of a male-female energy, and now it's devoid of a female energy. So these are
all different ways that cultures have thought about these things.
Yeah.
By the time it gets to the Middle Ages, you get what are called the Albigensians or the Cathars. And this was a Gnostic group, particularly in southern France, that thought that there was the world we see around us, which was entirely evil, and a good spiritual world, which was actually made by God. And so by this point, they saw the Demiurgos as essentially demonic, as something evil that had created the world, the physical world that we encounter.
I used to love the Gnostics. How did this happen?
In the late Gnostic world, we'd gone from a Greek concept of the origin of the physical world as being good, as being the origin of all good things, as being arranging out of chaos, to, by the Middle Ages, everything physical was bad. And so this was a rejection of that sort of female creative principle, or at least the unified creative principle. And so this had now separated these two things. There was the spiritual world, which would be the God before the Demiurgos that created our spirits, our souls, and we were trying to return to him. And then there was the Demiurgos, which created the real world, which we should reject and avoid procreation, avoid producing children. And so they like the Essenes, encouraged being celibate, but only after you'd reproduce. So they understood that reproduction was still important. So this kind of movement from a understanding of gender being both defined but also unified together, and that procreation comes out of this unification and out of this blending and mixing, and that all energy and magic and potential comes from the blending of opposites, of pluses and minuses, runs right through, I think, human history, right from the very beginning of the caves, right on down through. And one of the interesting things that I've recently come to understand is how this relates to alchemy. We often think of alchemy as a bunch of crazy people trying to make gold. And turn.
At least that's the way it's portrayed.
That's certainly the way it's portrayed. It's the way I learned it when I was studying philosophy. It was, the idea is, if you live in a Catholic world where the wafer that you eat is the actual body of Christ, you have what's called transubstantiation. the substance of the wafer is part of the substance of God himself. And so you're actually eating God when you eat that wafer.
I've never really been able to be cool with that, because that's when you think it through, it's a little creepy. But anyway.
One easy way to think about it is nothing is not God, and God is infinite, so everything has all of God in it. But that's a separate thing.
Well, yes, and that does something else entirely. So we could go there, but that's
like any piece of infinity is still infinity.
Let's not have that conversation
a different time. We thought that alchemy was all about that. That you take these accidents, is what the medieval philosophers called them. Accidents are what you would call color or temperature or all the things that we notice about a thing, right? Smell, the things you can touch, the hard surface or the soft surface. These are what they would call accidents. And then substance is the actual thing that has these accidental qualities. This is how the medievals thought about it.
Accidents are essentially what's manifest from a thing.
Right. So the way transubstantiation works is it keeps the accidents the same. That wafer doesn't taste any better. And you've just changed the substances.
What a beautiful way to make anything happen.
To make anything happen. And so the way alchemy is generally described is it's a spiritual approach to magic where you try and turn things that have lesser qualities into things that have higher qualities in the same way that the wafer is transformed into God. And so you could just, instead of changing the substance, maybe you can change the accidents without actually having to change anything.
But isn't the, I mean, I don't know anything about this, but isn't the whole point of that, it seems to me, that the wafer is changed into God in your mind?
No, it's real.
It's real.
It's real.
Actually really real.
It's really real.
It doesn't matter whether you believe it or not.
Yes, exactly. Which is why it's used in black magic. A consecrated wafer is more important than just a wafer. You can't just steal a wafer. You have to get one that's already been blessed if you then want to do your black magic.
And normally
using
it's blessed
the wafer.
And then immediately ingested.
Exactly, right. But if you want to really have apostasy, stand against God, then you have to get something that actually is God, and that's a wafer. And you steal one of those, now you got something you can work with your black magic.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay,
anyway,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
So there's this huge world of trying to manipulate these sort of potential deities before things actually come, before there are the accidents, before the division, before you have hot and cold, male and female, left and right. You have this unified whole from which anything can be produced. And so that is why you can combine the substance of a wafer and the substance of God, because everything is one thing, essentially. And this is what the alchemists were trying to work with. They're like, well, since everything is one thing, I can turn lead into gold, because it's just just make it a little bit shinier and more yellow, and suddenly I have gold.
Change the accidents
of the
lead and make it.
Yeah, and I don't have to really change anything at all. But when you actually look at alchemical texts, that wasn't really their project. They were definitely interested in gold, but they saw gold as gold and silver as these sort of exemplars of the sun and the moon, of male and female, of the two powers that in magic you put together to make something new. So just like the magic in the caves was taking the male and the female to produce something new, either through hunting magic, producing more animals to hunt, or producing something new in the culture, making a unified group of male and females coming together to make something new. This was happening, in the alchemical sense of, you would take silver and gold, and you would mix it with acids and mercury, and these were seen as the king and the queen, the mother and the father, dying, rotting. This was dissolving in acids, and then the mercury. Mercury was always associated with Hermes, Mercury, the god of communication, of carrying things across something. If we think about something as trans, Mercury is the one that brings things across. Mercury was often seen as not entirely male, but having a mixture, hermaphrodite, Hermes and Aphrodite together forming this whole as a hermaphrodite. So this idea of transformation, of being trans, was directly related to the substance mercury. And so you would put mercury in an acid bath of gold and silver, and you would get what's called a mercury amalgam. Mercury amalgams take metals, and they basically, it looks like something growing out of the metal.
Yes, we'll have to post links to this.
Yeah.
You have to see it.
You have to see it. It's easier with aluminum. Mercury aluminum amalgam is amazing. It grows in real time. But they were making things that would have been moving on their own. They would have appeared to be alive, and they would have grown. And so the idea is that the king and the queen would enter their bed. They would die. They would rot, and from them would grow this new thing that was bigger and more productive than the beginning. So if you were greedy, it meant you got more gold and silver. But if you were thinking about it in a spiritual sense, it was this unification of the gold and silver, of the king and queen, that produced this new thing that was more than what you started with.
I'm sure in that day and age, if you had shown me that, you could have sold me anything after that.
Oh, it moved.
Anything.
And grew.
Yeah. Anything.
And was made of metal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
I would have been like,
yeah,
you know stuff.
Exactly. So this is why alchemy was this long-term project. And it was always...
But what you're saying is they weren't actually trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to spiritually improve what? The world, themselves,
yes,
each other?
Through a unification of male and female that would produce this new thing, the true being, that was this combination.
Did they know that this was a parlor trick, or did they think they were creating something for the world?
Both. By let's say the early 17th century, it was already seen as a parlor trick by people who knew what was going on. But Newton was very involved in this. He absolutely believed in these things. And he was a very serious person. He was inventing physics and math, basically. You know, he was doing calculus. He was also put in charge of the mint, because he knew when something was gold or not gold. He actually got put in prison once when he was... There's this cool thing called the trial of the Picts, where they would take all the coins and put them in this big box called the Picts, and then periodically the coins would be taken out and tested. And if the head guy in charge of coins was on trial, literally, and if the coins turn out to not be as much silver as they were supposed to, he was sent to prison. And so Newton got sent to prison because his coins did not pass the trial of the Picts, and then he had to show them that, using his analytical techniques, which were better than theirs, he got the right answer. So he was absolutely doing alchemy on these things. He was using mercury to dissolve the silver so that he could then get the pure silver out of it, and he was weighing it before and after. But he was also busy inventing chemistry. So this is when chemistry and alchemy were dividing. But for Newton, it was absolutely the whole thing was one project. He was trying to figure out what this cosmos was, what had come from this early undivided world. So everything...
What a time that must have been.
I know. So he was trying to recreate the undivided world, this gold and silver, chemically. He was trying to understand when things were mixed together, what happens when you divide them. So he was sending white light through a prism and dividing it into the colors. He's the one that came up with 7 colors. It could have been arbitrary. There's either, billions of colors, or maybe there's 3 colors.
Right.
But he said it's 7 for the same reason that we have 7 notes, because 8 is infinity. Because you return back to the beginning again. You're at the beginning of the octave. This is coming from Pythagorean stuff, which is directly related to this Orphic mystery that we are talking about, the Pythagoreans and the Orphic mysteries. Pythagoreans were working with the square root of 2. Okay, there is no answer to the square root of 2. It's like pi. It's something that goes on forever. And if you're trying to find the hypotenuse, because you're Pythagoreans, you're likely to wind up with the square root of 2 in your problem. And then this was a central secret mystery for them. This was something that could not be divided. It was their undivided whole, was these things that had no end to them. So these were all things that we've been working on from the very beginning, and originally were seen as bringing genders together into this new magical being, or starting with a magical being, the demiurgos, and then the separation of everything. So you get meaning and power from the separation and from bringing things back together. And this has absolutely been central to our consciousness right from the very beginning. It's central to everything we've done. There were a lot of sort of things where during the Middle Ages, we started trying to move into a purely patriarchal approach to things. And I think this is what has caused some of the problems, but also possibly some of the power of our civilization, that through division, you create energy. By separating the two energies, you get this power. But by drawing lines between things, you also create separations and conflict. But as soon as you draw a line between something,
you also get weaknesses.
You get weaknesses, right? You draw a line through a country with the Mason-Dixon line, and suddenly you have a civil war. Well, not suddenly, but eventually you have a civil war. This is what Pynchon was talking about when he was talking about the book Mason-Dixon, was that the simple drawing of a line through something creates eventual conflict and problems. You build a wall, it's even worse. So these are things we're constantly experiencing in our psyche. It's something where we always have been striving for, certainly a lot of our recent history, to create strict walls between the genders. It's something that most religions have rules for: who sits where, who wears what clothing, how you act in a certain way, to make sure these genders never get together and never blend. And then when they actually do, when there's actual biological sex, it's very carefully regulated, has to be inside a marriage, approved by the church or the religion, has to be controlled in some way. And all of these things are efforts to deal with what has been this sort of through line through the growth of consciousness, is the idea of the unification of everything, the splitting apart of everything, and then the reunification of things, perhaps at a higher level. This is something we see in many of our philosophies. Ibn Khaldun talked about this kind of thing. The sort of spiral of history. It's the dialectic. It's the thesis antithesis comes together to form a thesis, and then you have a new thesis antithesis. This is central to everything we have always been doing, and you can sort of see where you have the dark forces are when you want things to be as extreme as possible at the two different sides and never having any mixing again. Whereas in my opinion, it's when you have things coming together that you have life and joy and pleasure and all of the good things of the world is coming from these potentials coming together. The Nazis were really into these things in both reality. They really, really didn't like some groups of people and wanted to separate them and define them and get rid of them and destroy them, so there would be no unity. But they also saw this in an alchemical sense. They definitely were looking at symbols, yes, ancient symbols, ideas of the sun, they talked about the black sun. They talked about these things that are right out of alchemy, and they always chose the evil symbols. They always had, the symbol of lightning and destruction, or the skull. The black sun in alchemy was the somewhat related to the Albigensian Cathar idea of this is the unreal. This is the sun that we see, but not the true spiritual sun. The black sun that the Nazis worshipped in alchemy was seen as the symbol of everything bad and impure and containing contamination from matter. Whereas the spiritual sun, the true spiritual sun, the higher sun, had no contamination from the matter. So all of these things, even when I'm talking about evil people trying to do separation, I've now created a separation between their philosophy and another philosophy. Mm-hmm. Every time we talk about things, we're talking about unity and separations. It's male and female, it's gender, it's light and dark. It's all of these metaphors that we use that are also real things in our life. It's the positive and negative electricity. It's the top and the bottom of the hill. It's hot and cold. All of these things are needed to make anything happen in the world. So, it's not just biology that has both strict gender roles, but also flexible gender roles, and they must be flexible for biology to work, right? You have to have ways to change how you're interacting with your world if your species is to survive.
But you also have to have rules,
but you have to
nothing will work.
Exactly. And so these rules must be flexible and related to the world you're living in. And these rules can lead you astray. So that's what we're starting out with the orcas. They have very strict rules that they can no longer leave behind that are going to probably make that population extinct in the future because they can't get past their own gender rules. And this is why I'm terribly optimistic about the flexibility of our culture, and I'm terribly pessimistic about our lack of flexibility. That we get stuck in these ways of thinking about things where we can't, we can't move forward because we're stuck in our particular sets of rules. And the act of creation and destruction is always the bringing these things together and dissolving them. It's the center for it's the central concepts in what people who are into magic these days are into. They talk about coagulation and dissolution, the bringing together and the separation. This is where all energy and movement comes from. So anyway, I just wanted to go through a history of a little bit of magic and alchemy and relate it to what we've been talking about with gender roles and understanding the importance of separation and the importance of unity and why some people cling to the separation, won't let go, and why I think the ability to rethink and come up with new ways of combining things really are the future of our civilization.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you. The question is, are we in a period right now where we are going to have a failure to proceed? Like it feels like we are being ripped apart at this very moment around the world in these forces of, do we stay separate and keep pulling ourselves apart, or do we find other way? Like, do we get back to what we were trying to do before? And
history says we're going to be doing both of these things at the same time. I'm worried because sometimes you can do the wrong thing for 1,000 years, and that would be the Middle Ages.
Yeah, well, I mean, it kind of, I'm having, I'm both pessimistic and optimistic, as you were saying. But if we lose democracy here, we're looking at some dark ages.
But we're very much in a period of flux. Obviously, nationally, and we were just discussing this. There could be a collapse of right wing irrational republicanism. Could collapse at any moment, or it could be triumphant,
or
and we're definitely at an inflection point. But the whole world is at an inflection point via population, right? So we were approaching a population bomb where it was going to explode. We talked about R versus K theory and how now the population is shrinking. Yeah. We're about to look at another kind of demographic disaster. A shrinking population does not work with capitalism. So we're in many ways at an inflection point where we can see the future dimly, but we are not necessarily dealing with it. It's a lot like global warming. We've known about global warming since the 50s. And we're only just beginning to get electric cars now.
Yeah, well, we thought we might be forced into a situation due to this peak oil, which seemed to just poof evaporate as we are generating more oil than we ever have in our history.
Well, yeah, I mean, that capitalism predicts that would happen, and always had.
That peak oil would go away. That was predicted.
Yes, yeah,
it was hoped for
from capitalistic theory, and. There's been predictions for things like peak oil many times in the past, and always it's the same answer. There's some sort of technological change or there's a movement. The one I'm really excited right now is hydrogen. And talk about things coming together and deities and all this kind of stuff. You've got, in my opinion, Gaia is making hydrogen for us. You have water unifying with rocks to give us the hydrogen we need for our entire economy. I think it may well be alive. Many of these processes
I
are done by bacteria.
But again, I mean, what you're talking about requires a severe coming together, because we
Yes.
would need to completely change the way we get our energy. And,
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about Taoism. I mean, now we're talking about the I Ching and acceptance of change, and the idea of the wheel is always turning. And that when you fight against change, you're going to be losing, and that's what reactionaries do.
I mean,
is always trying to.
This gets back to something that you said in an earlier podcast, but that we've been talking about for years. Is that for something like this, like a whole bunch of people need to die. Like I mean, of old age, if nothing else. Like there's nothing like that will change anytime soon until all these people who make that shit happen stop.
Yeah, we often think of ourselves as rational actors, and that science advances because we discover something new, and then that new discovery convinces everyone else. But there are people who pointed out that very often it's when the old guard retires or dies.
Yeah.
And that's really how progress happens.
Yeah.
Even in the scientific world.
I mean, I was many years ago, I was tutoring I was teaching this gentleman from China who had emigrated to the United States. And he specifically asked, why did you leave? And he said, because I can't move up and I can't make any changes. I worked and the people above me won't let anybody do anything. And it isn't until somebody dies that people can move up. And I can't live like that. And I left for opportunity. He literally said, it's not until people above him die.
So this is the creative destruction process. This is why capitalism has a lot going for it, because it has built into it this idea of creation and destruction and something new coming out of it. But it is also a system that needs to be governed, and we tend to think of it as a goal in itself.
Yeah.
This is a problem that we have, that where we start seeing what should be a process as a goal. What should be the goal is happiness and abundance for us all. And what is actually the goal is, our goal is to let capitalism run over us all like a tank.
Well, the eloquent way that you describe this constant desire to pull apart and come together just highly illustrates what an inflection point we're at right now.
This is our moment in time, and it's absolutely glass half full, glass half empty. But what it's full of and what it's empty of are really good and bad. We're at a very exciting and distressing but interesting moment,
and a moment that not every generation has to or gets to live through.
I'm highly optimistic of where we'll be in 1,000 years. I'm really worried about where we'll be in 50 years.
We have kids, man. That sucks.
I know. But it could all be better next year. I mean, we could be done with Trump and everything by next year.
I find that highly win or lose. I find that highly unlikely, but I'll go with it.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks, Josh. That was fascinating.